Okay, today I have the pleasure of interviewing Jeffrey Rothschild, Dr. Jeffrey Rothschild, as of recently. Congratulations again on defending your PhD. And today we're going to be talking about pre-exercise nutrition and regulators of intramuscular signaling and adaptations to endurance training. So very excited to dig in because a lot of your research, Jeff, has influenced a lot of my thinking. So this is really an honor and pleasure to chat with you. So before we dig in and get started, I would love to talk about your background and give you a chance to just introduce yourself.
Cool. Well, I certainly appreciate the nice words and the invitation. I think I'm not technically doctor yet. It still has to like be stamped. I mean, it's all been submitted and approved and all that, but I think I'm not allowed to change my email signature quite yet.
Okay.
Hopefully pretty soon.
I'm just foreshadowing for you.
Yeah, no, it's sooner or later. But yeah, I'm I guess see myself as a sports dietitian, sports nutritionist. I lived in Los Angeles for 20 years before moving to Auckland for my PhD. And now, having finished that, I was continuing here for at least the foreseeable future, working as a performance nutritionist at High Performance Sport New Zealand, which is kind of working with some of the elite athletes, which has been a really nice fit and a nice way to apply some, the research and just kind of apply it's straddling the application and the research really nicely. So I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, that's super cool. So I think you have a very interesting background. If I'm not mistaken, you worked in the music industry prior to.
Yeah. Before that, yeah. So I'm 45. My 20s were spent in music. I was a recording engineer and mixer and drummer on kind of records and things. And then I just really got cycling was kind of a hobby, and learning about nutrition was a hobby. And then at some point, I just wanted to pursue it further. And I was progressively, I guess, tired of doing what I had been doing, and so it just seemed like a not necessarily a logical next step, but certainly a appealing step. And I went back to school and did my master's in nutrition, became a registered dietitian. That was I guess around 2011 or so, 2010, 2011, somewhere there. And then it's been kind of spent some time in practice, still staying involved in research after I finished my master's, and again, mostly in daily practice. And then I wanted to go back and do a PhD.
Super cool. I'm always interested in like the actual like logistics and practicality of people's life journey. Like, how did you have to do like courses to apply for your master's, and like how did that happen?
Yeah, I guess I assume people don't really care about that, but if you're curious, I had done a Bachelor of Arts in music. So while it's like completely unrelated, the thing that actually surprised me almost the most when I was looking into all that was that you could actually go from a bachelor in one thing to a master's in literally anything else. Of course, there is some prerequisites. So I had to take some like community college classes, or just had to go through like, the chemistry and the stuff that I like, some of which I had and some of which I hadn't done. So I had to do those first before I got into the master's courses. So yeah, it was a bit of like, I guess not necessarily backpedaling or backtracking, but you just had to kind of cover those bases. It was funny, so I worked, like I said, with a lot of kind of famous artists. But as I was at the end of my music career, like I remember within the span of like, it felt like it must have been a week, I was on a helicopter with Bon Jovi, on Bon Jovi's helicopter, and then like a week later sitting in this like 1960s era community college chemistry class, classroom. But it was great. It was kind of really what I was ready for. It was a nice change. I appreciated it, and again find it kind of comical, the juxtaposition. But it wasn't like in a negative way. It was just like, this is, again, I'll look back on this and laugh. And
well, your appealing option was clearly worth it for you to take those steps.
So far, yeah.
I like to look at life like that. Like, you can have all these different chapters that make up your book that have nothing to do with each other, which is pretty cool.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's the one thing that, actually, speaking of Bon Jovi, he said when I kind of tell people I was going to stop doing music, and this, it ain't a life sentence. Anything we do, people like kind of get stuck into one avenue or career, and it's not a life sentence. Maybe once upon a time you had to do the same thing for your whole life, but for younger people who think, oh, I got to choose the one thing I'm going to do, like that's like, especially in this stage and age, it's just not the case.
Totally. Okay, so you did your master's and then you got your RD, registered
Yeah,
dietitian.
master's, and that kind of went along. There was kind of an overlapped program. So
Okay.
you do your master's, and then like that's a lot of the coursework goes towards being a registered dietitian, and then you have to do the internship hours and all that. But it kind of is more or less was done at the same time.
And then you worked as a sports nutritionist
Yeah, like in
or
mostly private
dietitian.
practice setting. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I
Yeah, I did
didn't mean to
that
offend you.
for. I don't know. That's a funny one. Uh, so yeah, so for I think 4 or 5 years just doing that, just working with people, which was obviously learned a lot, and like I said, did kind of stay involved with some small research things. But I really enjoyed that. But then I just kind of got to the point where I thought there would be some good, that'd be, it's just something I wanted to do to kind of pursue the research a bit more instead of relying on other people to do the research. I wanted to have a better understanding and foundation of how to do it. The people I really admired were these kind of researcher practitioners, and so it just seemed like a good next step.
When you were working with clients and athletes, was there a lot of just unanswered questions where you're like, oh, I just want to do the research myself to answer these questions?
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. And I guess you hit it, but then I wasn't necessarily like just like mad. Like it's just there was lots of questions that you couldn't answer, and it wasn't because there was obviously plenty of great minds that are working on the case, but there's just like the basic question of what should I eat before exercise was like surprisingly elusive. And I
Mhm.
suppose it still is, and I don't know how much more my PhD has helped him. That's I suppose we could talk about, but yeah, like there was just when I realized how many of the big questions I couldn't even answer for the people I was working with. I mean, we had, I found myself going, oh, well, we kind of think this, and in this context, and obviously, you make some educated guesses, and we kind of have some idea. But like when I realized just how many, unanswered key questions there were for kind of my curiosity, my interest in daily practice, I've essentially came to the point of going, I can wait for someone else to just kind of answer these things, and maybe it will, maybe it won't, and it'll just be like whatever, or I can try to be a bit more proactive and try to, like you said, answer them, and help out and answer them.
And so you were obviously, so your passion hobby was cycling, and you took a liking to that, and you were interested in nutrition. Now you have this experience with sports nutrition. And how did you end up in Auckland, New Zealand?
Yeah, so when I was looking at PhD programs, kind of looked at like a lot of just kind of looked at the landscape of good places, like from a research standpoint, like reputable places, places doing good work, places where I knew their work, and the the kind of the area of research that was of interest. And then also for me, I wanted somewhere where I could kind of create my own PhD plan, where some places, and it's not necessarily good or bad, but there's like, there's a very clear, you're fitting into a research question that's already, paid for, funded and kind of designed, and which is, fine. But I like in our lab, like it's very much like there's a lot of open, there's flexibility and autonomy to kind of create the direction, presuming it fits obviously within the context and expertise and the capabilities of the lab. So that was kind of one that part of it. And so kind of between all the boxes, like some, again, flexibility in the topic, a decent, nice place to live, somewhere with a good track record, and kind of just all those things. And certainly this wasn't the only place that could fit that box, but this just seemed like a good fit for me and my wife, and I had a 2-year-old at the time. So
Yeah,
so
that's a big move with a family.
yeah, yeah, it was.
Well, it obviously worked out. So now we've made it in your life timeline to your PhD. So let's start with so the start of your research. So you can start from like your first research study, and I think it was with the surveying athletes and
Yeah.
figuring out what people think they're doing, or yeah, I'll let you
Yeah.
explain
No,
that.
we can. Yeah, I guess that if we kind of suppose walk through the PhD chronologically. Yeah, the first thing was a survey of, ended up being about 2,000 endurance athletes, looking at what they're doing before exercise and kind of why, and kind of what shapes the decisions of. But like again, this basic question of like how many people do fasted training. There was some research in smaller groups of elite athletes, but there wasn't like when you think of just like the large as a whole group of like people doing triathlons and marathons, like kind of recreational athletes. It's pretty there wasn't a whole lot in terms of like said what are people what are people really doing? Are they choosing to eat carbs before training? Why or why not? If are they choosing fasted training, why or why not? And again, there has been answered in like the elite race walkers and runners, and there's certainly been work in that, but across like the kind of the, let's say the the group with the most people in it, the most like the kind of the weekend warriors. Not actually, I shouldn't even use that term, because many recreational triathletes train quite a lot, and take it very seriously. But again, so just across this large group, there wasn't, I felt like there wasn't great answers in terms of what people were doing. So we did that, and it got some interesting kind of direction to go from there, because we found about 2/3 of athletes do some type of fasted training, like do at least once in a while, which was not, I guess, entirely surprising, but it was just kind of nice to kind of have a number there.
And that means like they're purposely doing fasted training, like intentionally.
Well, intentionally, yeah, but then like, yeah, waking up in the morning and training without eating, but the rationale was quite different. Some people thought it was going to help them, get a better training adaptation. Some people just woke up early and didn't want to eat anything. Some people wanted to avoid gut discomfort. Some people wanted to burn more fat. So there was a lot of reasons. And then also, what was interesting is some people, there was a third of athletes thought, let's say fasted training would be helpful to the training. Maybe a third was thought kind of wouldn't matter either way, and then a third kind of thought it would be harmful. And so it was interesting that like there was very strong views that were kind of in contradiction of each other, and so that kind of gave again like a little more direction to the future studies to say, okay, here's kind of what people think. And then there's obviously been plenty of research looking at especially acutely fed versus fasted training, but kind of there's still some more avenues to explore with that. And so that kind of set up the subsequent studies that we were going to do.
Yeah, super interesting. And so what was the, like, I guess, majority of the reason people thought it was good?
The biggest reason people did it was to increase their fat burning.
Okay.
And it's a limitation on my end to say, to discern between, are you burning more fat on that workout versus trying to be a better fat burner, over time.
I would love to know the relationship between the two of those.
Yeah, I still don't know. We kind of looked at it, and it's a tricky one. I think my feeling, I mean, definitely acutely, if you're not eating carbs before a workout, if you're fasted, you're going to burn more fat than if you're fed like that. There's nothing controversial about that. But even then, when people not everyone agreed about that, and that's a very clear, like, there's nothing controversial, but maybe I forget how many, 20 or 30% people kind of didn't necessarily think that was the case. So there's just an educational component there that's lacking. But yeah, I mean, anecdotally, from coaches and even in my own experience doing fasted training, you can increase your fat max, your fat oxidation capacity. Definitely or most likely when tested in the fasted state. It's still a big question of whether that changes anything when you're actually in the fed state.
Right. Which would matter if for performance and like racing.
Yeah,
it's super interesting. But also, like, if we can improve fat max with high intensity exercise, that's not burning fat, and we're improving fat oxidative capacity, which kind of goes against why burning fat at moderate intensity, or like burning more fat, would promote better fat adaptations. You know what I'm trying to get at?
Well, yeah, I know what you're getting at. And I guess we can kind of skip ahead into the kind of the molecular side of it. And I didn't look a ton into this, but there was a few aspects that we kind of touched on. So, but I guess just to step back, if we think about the signaling that happens, there's different pathways, right? And we can broadly think of it in terms of like, so we do exercise, and then there's a stimulus, the exercise at the top of the chart, and then the changes in your body would be at the bottom. We have the contraction induced signaling, right? So there's just the muscle contracting is going to cause a signal. There's the energy sensing pathway, so like the AMPK pathway. So if there's low energy, the energy sensor comes on from low energy, then that'll cause some adaptations. There's the reactive oxygen species, and that pathway, and then there's the free fatty acids, like the nutrient signaling. So there's glycogen and free fatty acids. Those are also doing some signaling. I think that's it. I should have had. I know you know all this, but just to kind of frame our picture. And then the contraction-induced pathways, like that, doesn't seem to be affected by nutrition very much. That's just by doing the training. There's that signaling is going to happen. The reactive oxygen species and that kind of signaling. I looked at one part of that. I looked at if pre-exercise nutrition influenced the the isoprostanes, so basically kind of like a measure of oxidative stress during exercise. And I found it was very variable, and it was in an acute crossover study. It didn't really have much of an influence.
Okay.
So that's not certainly an open shut case there, but it made me kind of think, okay, it's probably that's not the pathway to kind of focus on too much in terms of pre-exercise nutrition.
If
Then
pre-exercise, sorry to interrupt you,
no,
but if pre-exercise nutrition was affecting reactive oxygen species and signaling related to that, would that mean that it's changing some sort of mitochondrial metabolism?
I mean, it theoretically it could, or I suppose that would.
Okay.
I suppose it could, but yeah,
Or
I mean, I
are
guess
ROS generated elsewhere?
that's a good question. That's
Sorry.
that's above my pay grade right now. I mean, I think they are generated. There's different all over, right? And so I'm not sure how. I suppose, yeah, I don't know. There's some reason to think like you consume olive oil and then it reduces the ROS, and there's a few like mechanistic studies that could make you think like whey protein, and because of the glutathione, like an increased glutathione, and kind of change things that way. So there was enough reason to think like, oh, maybe it can affect something, but at least
Okay.
in a study, I didn't really see any difference.
Right. Okay. So, and just for anyone who's listening to this, you looked at carbohydrate, protein, and fat fasted and compared those
Yeah,
three.
that's true. Yes, we had three. Yeah, that's right. Three trials. And I had people do like a submaximal exercise and then an interval training session, with either fasted or with a carb breakfast or with a kind of a protein and fat breakfast, which was like whey protein and some peanut butter.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I totally derailed you from all your.
No, that's okay.
You're
Yeah, it's
going
okay.
through like
So,
the energy centers and then
well,
everything.
yeah. So those two, then I've kind of like not too focused on, and then we can kind of think about the AMPK pathway. And so one of my kind of port slices of the thesis was kind of a type of meta-analysis looking into kind of wondering if pre-exercise nutrition is influencing the AMPK signaling pathway. And in short, we can come back to the details, but I don't think it really is.
Okay.
The glycogen levels would. Your ending glycogens are certainly important. And so if we think about everything from the last workout, everything you've consumed from the last workout till this workout, then yeah, that's technically pre-exercise nutrition. But if we're thinking about just in the 1 hour, hour and a half, 2 hours before a given workout, I don't think the overall the what you're eating is going to influence AMPK signaling really at all.
Okay. This is interesting. I'm gonna just derail again and ask you
Sure.
questions as we go.
Sure.
But so you say that you don't think pre-exercise nutrition affects AMPK signaling, and I mean there are divergent studies showing like, oh, it does,
Yeah.
oh, it doesn't. So why do you think we have differing results from different studies? Like, what's the main takeaway, I
No,
guess?
I think a few. I think the protocol. So some of the studies that looked at like fasted versus fed will just look at a single 30-second sprint.
Okay.
And not to say that that's invalid or anything, but sometimes it's the time point. So a pre-exercise, pre to post-exercise, a pre-exercise muscle biopsy and then a post-exercise like 30 seconds later, you're not going to catch that AMPK signaling, and there could be it can affect kind of, I think, the results if you then look at like an hour later, like there's less differences, or 3 hours later.
Yeah.
Also, some of the studies will look at AMPK alpha 2 activity, and some look at phosphorylated AMPK, and some look at phosphorylated ACC. And in that paper, we kind of looked at the relationship. They're all highly related. Those three markers get used interchangeably. They're quite different. But when people say, oh, AMPK activation or a marker of AMPK activation, there's these three different ones, and I think they don't always all tell the same story. So I looked at the relationship between them in that paper, and it was certainly significant and strong. I'm forgetting the correlation, maybe 0.7 or somewhere around there. But I think that can contribute to some of these differences. So we might see an influence on p-AMPK, but not on AMPK activity.
Okay.
So there's differences there.
Why would there be differences? Like what? Like you're saying they're related, but like how are they different?
They're the analyzing AMPK activity that shows the extent of phosphorylation by its kinase, and not the activity that's subject to the additional allosteric activation by AMP So it's possible. So basically, so PACC, so phosphorylated ACC, might be more of a sensitive marker of AMPK activity because it's reflecting these covalent and allosteric modifications.
Okay.
That basically it's kind of the way it's being I guess signaled and the time, and again, so the timing of the measurement is going to be, yeah, it's I wish I could explain it. I was being more eloquent about it, but
Okay.
basically there's covalent and allosteric modulation, and those can be picked up, I guess, differently in the different signals.
Okay.
In
Interesting.
in the different markers.
I should know more about this. So now I'm
It
motivated.
is pretty interesting. Like honestly, like and if I look, actually, I'll look at the relationship between those measures. And let's see, where was it? Oh,
I love that you turned into like a data scientist also during your PhD.
yeah, that was yeah. And actually, yeah. So to get back to you on that, actually, so the correlation. So if we look at the effect size of when studies have measured both AMPK alpha 2 activity and phosphorylated AMPK or phosphorylated ACC, and I looked at kind of the relationship between those when there's and between any two, and the correlation was only 0.56 between PAMPK and alpha 2 activity, and then it's 0.37 between PAMPK and PACC, and 0.35 between A2 activity and PACC. So like there is it's literally a significant correlation, but it's not that strong.
Yeah.
And so definitely like they are kind of showing different things, which is yeah, I think, one of the unique findings of that.
Okay, so aside from like measurement and different protocols for measuring these things, what else, like, do you think just like the amount of carbs they're feeding people or the timing of the carbohydrate intake?
Yeah, it could be. But I think the bigger one by far would be glycogen. So glycogen, like the ending glycogen level, glycogen will certainly, there's binding sites for AMPK, and like there's definitely a relationship between the glycogen reduction or the ending glycogen and AMPK activation. And so that is going to matter so much more. And then also the intensity of exercise. So if you're like, basically, if you exercise above, let's say critical power, so anything that's going to cause an increased ratio of AMP or ADP to ATP, but that's the key thing that's going to signal AMPK. So you could be full of glycogen and fed, but if you go hard enough, you're going to get an AMPK activation.
Right.
Because you're going to disrupt the cellular energy homeostasis, and that's what's going to activate AMPK. Now, if we're talking about an easy cycling session or something, then that's where the nutrition can have an influence there, and that's where I think. But it's more about the glycogen than the pre-exercise level or the pre-exercise intake.
How would you separate the effects of AMP and ADP from glycogen depletion if AMP and ADP is also a trigger for glycogen depletion?
Well, because you can measure someone with high glycogen and then just do like a 30-second sprint and deplete their AMP will come up, and ADP will come up because ATP will go down, and you'll still have plenty of glycogen in there, right?
You'll still have a ton of glycogen, is that what you said?
Well, plenty, yeah. I mean, you could deplete a lot in 30 seconds, but still, if you started with a full tank of gas and you did a 30-second sprint, or even a 20, 10 or 20-second sprint, you'd cause that cellular energy imbalance that should turn on AMP, AMPK, and you'd still have a reasonable amount of glycogen in there.
Right. Okay. But in the studies where pre-exercise carbohydrates do attenuate the increase in signaling in AMPK, like, you're just coming back to, well, they were measuring different things, or
I think so. Yeah. I'd have to kind of look back, and that paper definitely addresses those things, but I think it's definitely not like a clear relationship, and when you account for other things like fitness level or glycogen level, then in intensity, there's just not the relationship that people might expect or might have been curious to see.
Yeah. Okay. So then beyond that, the fatty acid signaling,
and
pre-exercise nutrition would have an impact on.
I didn't look at that. It was kind of like after the fact going, okay, we've looked at each of these more or less each of these kind of other pathways, if there's going to be a benefit to fasted training over the long term, I think it's going to be there. And that's the I guess a prediction or just a hypothesis that I throw out there. I do think it's possible certainly to see like to have a benefit over time of doing some fasted training. Said if there's going to be the benefit, I think it's the free fatty acid signaling, because that's a key difference in obviously fed and fasted training. There's kind of debate, or not debate, but it's not clear like at what point, how long you'd have to do fasted training to see a difference. I mean, some people, I know Trent has Stellingworth studies that I think it's around 45 minutes. Others will show a little sooner, a little later. Like there's some point at which, like, obviously 10 minutes of fasted training won't do anything if it's easy, but like at a point you'd see a difference. And I think that signaling, I think that's, like I said, where you might see some longer term, adaptations and changes.
Like if you're doing longer durations in the fasted state.
Yeah. And like even an hour or so, but like over longer term, like multiple times.
Yeah,
because you're going to accumulate a difference in that free fatty acid signaling. That's like I said, yeah. If there's going to be a difference, that's probably where it would be.
What is the fatty acid signaling? Like, what's downstream?
There's PPAR, and Andreas Fritzen has a ton of papers that group, and his colleague Lundgaard.
But it's related to just like the upregulation of like transporters, enzymes.
Probably all of
storage.
those. I would have to guess several. I would think. Some good questions today. This is feels like my PhD defense, but with surprise questions. No, but I think it's
stick to your papers.
No. This is good. This is a good conversation. No, I think it is in the. I would suspect transporters, and also the potentially some you might get some mitochondrial biogenesis. So the great review by Andreas and Bent Keynes and called tuning fatty acid oxidation through diet, or something like that.
Oh, cool.
I'll tell you.
I'll have to find that.
But that's really that has all the answers. It's that would be the proper title is called Tuning Fatty Acid Oxidation in Skeletal Muscle with Dietary Fat and Exercise. So Andreas Fritzen is the first author, Anna Marie Lundsgaard is the second author, and Bent Keynes third author. So that is everything you need to know. Nature Reviews, endocrinology. So that they have far more answers than me on this one, and they explain all the mechanisms of why that might be the case. But I think there is definitely evidence. There's a lot of mechanistic evidence for why that's the case. We haven't kind of seen it so clearly yet, but I think that's probably the place to look.
Okay, sweet. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay. You've mentioned a couple times, like, if there's a benefit to fasted exercise, and I listened to you on another podcast, and you really skirt around the like, well, this is the physiology, but like what it means, I don't know. So where do you stand, I guess, on fasted exercise?
Yeah, I had a training study that was like halfway completed, that then COVID just put a major wrench in things, and I had to pause it. And it's plausible to come back to it at some point, but it would have really, no one study is going to answer the question, but it was really set up like in a way that I think overcame a lot of the limitations. So what I had was only 3 weeks, but long enough. That's long enough to see something. The same with 3 groups as we mentioned before. So I had a fasted group, a pre-exercise protein group, and a carbohydrate group. Eating that before exercise, and they were doing 4 low intensity sessions a week with that in that protocol, and 2 interval training sessions a week with a standardized like snack beforehand. So one of the there's a few big issues, and I understand why they've done it, like in these previous fasted training studies where they would stack the deck. The carb group would have like 150 grams of carbs beforehand and like 60 grams an hour or something during, which is just like insane for moderate exercise, and then you compare it to fasted. So it's like, of course, but again, the point is to magnify differences in certain types of studies, but there's not been any kind of real world protocols with athletes that are trained, and so I had trained athletes doing, like I said, that kind of protocol, which I think is very realistic. Pre-exercise protein is, we kind of mentioned it in passing. I think that's one of the big kind of things from the PhD also, and certainly not the first to look at it, but it's not been studied very much. And for people that want to burn a lot of fat during exercise, but they don't want to be fasted for one reason or another, they can have, let's say, protein shake or some eggs, or basically a low carbohydrate breakfast, and you get essentially the same kind of result in terms of physiology of from being fasted. You're still going to burn roughly the same amount of fat. It's not that, you know, you're it's not going to shut down your fat burning the way a carb-rich breakfast would.
Right.
So I had that training study kind of like with biopsies and you know, a bunch of pre and post tests, and kind of really just set up to answer the questions that I was really curious about. And then just, you know, our New Zealand had some kind of when you know, some of the crazier lockdowns as countries go. And so anyway, yeah, I just had that kind of just I had like with 2 hours notice, we just like had to halt everything, and then for months and months at a time, and it just I didn't know. Anyway, it just got paused. You know, there was still the data, and I think you know, it'd be nice to go back to it. So with that said, you know, that would have been a really good step towards answering to feeling a little bit more confident in you know, adding a little bit more color and texture to what's available out there in terms of fasted training.
Yeah.
Without that, and without, you know, other studies that are kind of set up in a similar way where you're doing some of your training fasted, some of your training not. And it's also distinct from the sleep low studies. I think those are amazing, but those are like a couple of more steps further, where I think there's still this basic question of the fasted training, like what is it doing? Because I think, you know, so just to get people up, the sleep low studies where someone would do like an interval training at night and then only have like some protein, so sleep with a low carbohydrate availability, then wake up in the morning and typically do a fasted easy training session. I think I guess evolutions of that would be people could certainly have a pre-exercise protein in the morning for that. For the sleep low, like in the morning sessions, I think that would probably help people a bit, just feel a bit better. I also think they could probably have carbs right before, and still get the same benefit, because you're undertaking that morning session with low glycogen. So if you have, even if you had you know, a bagel 10 minutes before you went, that's not going to do anything for your muscle glycogen. It might help your liver glycogen, or, you know, raise your blood sugar, but your muscle glycogen is still going to have that low signaling. Now, if we did that study and there was a kind of a blunted benefit, then we could say, yeah, then pre-exercise carbohydrate are attenuating something. But if you did that study and then there was no difference between like sleep low fasted in the morning and sleep low with a carb before training, then we'd see, yeah, maybe it's you know, is it the low glycogen, or is it the kind of the free fatty acid signaling that would help tease that out?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good study design.
Yeah, it'd be hard to do. So, but that's why I went back to the study I was doing. It's like we still have some of these, I think, key questions are still kind of to be answered. So to your question, yeah, I think there could be a benefit, but I still don't know.
Yeah. Okay. And in that study design, you said you gave them a snack before the high intensity. Was that just because like general sports recommendations are to have some fuel on board before a high intensity?
Well, no,
workout?
it's actually no, because I wanted the groups to have the same breakfast. Like I wanted to be matched across groups for those sessions, and I wanted just a basic. I didn't want them to be fasted, because then you'd have other groups doing, like it just seemed like the best way to be a fed as a control. And
Wait,
yeah, just instead of,
were they doing low intensity and high intensity during the week? Or were you just
yeah, on
comparing?
different days. Yeah,
Yeah.
different days. So it was a mix. So four sessions a week of their low intensity training with their specific group, and then the two interval sessions were standardized snacks, so that everyone was just kind of on the same page. It was kind of just a medium. It was like a nut bar kind of thing, like just a little bit of carb, fat, and protein.
Oh, so that you could only compare the low intensity.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, missed that.
Yeah, while still giving them a real stimulus, you know, and a real type of training session. And actually, I should mention though that the other study, so we had an acute study, the one we mentioned before about the oxidative stress. One of the things coming out of the survey was that, you know, a lot of people believe their performance would suffer if they were fasted. And while that's certainly true for probably long, you know, 90-minute plus sessions, this session was an hour. It was 6 by 3 minute best effort intervals after some warm up, and there was no difference in any condition. Like the average watts were like within a watt of each other. You know, so fed, fasted, or with protein, you know, carb fed, protein fed, or fasted, no difference on an interval training capacity. You know, again, we're talking about like an hour-long session.
Yeah, no, that's a great message too, because like if you're rolling out of bed and going into a high intensity workout, some people will force themselves to eat because they're like, oh, I have to eat. It's a high intensity workout. But not everyone
Yes.
wants to eat, and it's good
Yeah,
just
your
to like
performance won't
have that
suffer. Yeah.
option. Yeah, it's like you're
Yeah.
gonna survive. Your muscle glycogen will get you through.
That's right. Yeah. Now, if someone's training, more than 8 hours a week or so, then I think they should probably, for other reasons, just to not create such a deficit and they're training so much. But if someone's training, or more exercising, an hour a day or give or take, then it'd be totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think we can extrapolate from endurance athletes and like what we know about nutrient timing around their training sessions? What could we extrapolate that to like the general public? Because the adaptations that promote performance are also the adaptations that promote health. So yeah, like how do you feel about nutrient timing and carbohydrate availability, I guess specifically for getting the best adaptations and then hopefully health benefits out of our exercise? I know this isn't like your focus, you are in the athlete and
Yeah.
performance
Yeah. But
world,
no,
but
that's a good question. I think if we're talking about someone just kind of like exercising, an hour a day roughly,
yeah.
so like less than 7 hours a week or so,
Mhm.
yeah, I think they want to be fed. I don't think they need to do low carbohydrate training really in any way. I do think within day energy balance is a really important thing, and that's just briefly for people that have not heard of that. It's easy to, a lot of people just think, oh, if I match my calories in and my calories out for the day, then I'm good. But let's say we need 2,500 calories, or we burn 2,500 calories, we eat 2,500. It's easy to imagine that if you did your exercise in the morning and didn't eat all day and ate your 2,500 calories at dinner, that wouldn't be ideal. Like everyone, I think most people would agree with that or could see that. So digging these really big deficits, calorie deficits, and eating like a tiny breakfast and then a healthy lunch and then eating the rest of your calories at dinner is just not a good thing, especially when you've exercised in the morning. So kind of keeping more of your calories around your exercise window, I think, is a really important. It's probably one of the best messages for health, in this context. But as far as like, yeah, low glycogen training per se, I don't think is necessary. And then this concept of fuel for the work required, obviously, it makes perfect intuitive sense to people to say, okay, if you're training more, eat more carbs, and if you're training less or easier, then eat less carbs. So I think people can still certainly adjust their carbohydrate intake based on their training, even if they're just exercising 4 or 5 hours a week. But they don't need to kind of think about like a low carbohydrate availability session per se.
Interesting. I would have thought the opposite. It's like if you're exercising less, you would want to, like, volume of an athlete probably supersedes any effective pre-exercise nutrition. But for someone who doesn't have that volume, maybe that's where it matters most. But you're saying that it doesn't, which is
Yeah, I wouldn't think so, because they're getting this. Well, I mean, again, let's just say someone that maybe does a couple of days a week of strength training, maybe does a group class or spin class or something, and a couple whatever. Like, just imagine that you have to think about that. A typical example. Yeah, you're gonna get like the AMPK, for example. If you do something hard, if you go above your kind of critical power and create a muscle energy imbalance, you're gonna get some signaling. You don't need low glycogen for that. And if you're doing strength training, like you're gonna be fueled, that's not gonna affect anything. Like I just don't see how it's going into exercise with the low carbohydrate availability or something is at all beneficial. Now, with that said, I think if you can better match your carbs on a daily basis, I do think that's sensible. So I guess some periodized aspects of their nutrition are indeed important. It's just that it doesn't need to be kind of like low carbohydrate availability training.
Okay. So yeah, let's get into the within day energy balance, because I know, like you said, this is something you've been increasingly interested in.
Yeah.
So like a concern with fasted training for athletes or someone with a big training volume could be that they're just in this low energy availability state for most of the day.
Well, yeah, or at least for part of the day. I mean, at least the morning part, and it also depends kind of on your fitness. So someone that's not very fit, that just goes on, a stationary bike for a half hour, might only burn, a couple hundred calories. It's not a big deal. But someone who's very fit can easily burn 800, 900, 1,000 calories an hour. And then they might also do longer sessions. So if they do an hour and a half or 2 hour session fasted, there's like easily a 1,500 plus calorie deficit to start the day, which already you're in a bit of a deficit because you wouldn't have eaten since I generally dinner the night before. And so probably not ideal, because then and most people aren't going to make that up immediately at breakfast, and so you're kind of behind the curve for the rest, for at least another meal or two, a good chunk of the day. So you're spending a large portion of the day in kind of deficit, and then gradually you might creep out of it, but by the end of the day. So someone that's, again, not training very long or very very fit, then it doesn't really matter. But yeah, the fitter you are, the bigger the hole you can make. In that case, if you want to still increase your fat oxidation, you could again go in with low glycogen, but maybe have carbs during, or even a carb right before, or you have some protein and something beforehand to kind of alleviate that, or carbs during. It's another thing that's emerged from those. So some of my studies is like it doesn't affect things the way people think it does. Like someone that goes on a 3-hour bike ride and they want to really burn fat, like they could have a sports drink throughout the ride and they'd still be burning plenty of fat, because duration really is way more important for dictating fat oxidation than like carbs during exercise.
Right.
And so there's another strategy there that you can kind of avoid such a big hole, creating such a big hole.
Yeah, and like the carbs during versus like having them before, and then, or like starting the bout of exercise in the fasted state and then having carbs during. I always think about it as like, okay, we've already activated lipolysis, we've already activated GLUT4, contraction-mediated GLUT4 translocation. So like you're just putting in glucose into the system and everything's already like taken care of, and it can like just leave without the need for insulin.
Totally. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And I think that's underappreciated by people.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's a cool strategy if people wanted to, I guess, mimic the physiology of fasted exercise, but what that means, we don't know. Okay, so this latest paper that you just published, if you could introduce it.
So this one, it was part of, so the last, I guess, just to step back, so the PhD, we had the survey, we had some acute studies, acute study looking at the difference in performance and oxidative stress. Then there was like this AMPK analysis and another analysis kind of similarly looking at the factors affecting fat oxidation. And then it was going to be in that training study, which we just talked about, which got paused. So then I kind of needed to something I could do remotely. And so what I kind of came onto, and you mentioned passing, and we could come back to, but kind of the interest in data science kind of has became a big part of my PhD and my practice nowadays. But essentially what I did is I had 55 athletes that people that, well, first of all, I realized some people really like tracking things, which kind of surprised me. I didn't realize how much, like some people just track their diet anyway, and they track all their training and they track their HRV and they track their sleep. And probably all know some people like this. And I thought, well, gosh, if there's a few people like this, there must be more. And so if I could recruit from anywhere in the world, there could be something pretty cool to find out there. So what I did was I got 55 athletes that recorded all those things: their diet, their training, their sleep, their HRV, every day for 12 weeks. And it allowed me to see some really cool stuff. There's a few papers that are kind of in the works. I mean, just looking at, again, what are people doing? Are they adjusting their carbohydrate intake based on their training? So I think some are, some aren't. So there's a lot to look at and share in that department. But this paper that just came out, it's called The Influence of Dietary Carbohydrate on Perceived Recovery Status Differs at the Group and Individual Level, Evidence of Non-Ergodicity Among Endurance Athletes. So I know that's a mouthful. It's one of my favorite new words, ergodicity or non-ergodicity. I learned a couple years ago from a paper. But basically, if we think about, it's this concept of whether or not group results at the group level can be applied to the individual. And this is different than kind of like individual responders and that, but can we generally kind of apply group findings to individuals? And the way we test for this, it's kind of interesting. It might be easier to imagine, but if you look, if you think about a Rubik's cube, and we sliced it in horizontally or vertically. Let me try to let's see if we can paint a picture in your mind's eye here. Imagine we have I'm going to try to explain the Rubik's cube. Basically, here's the easy way to think of it. So we analyze the data at the group level and the individual level. So at the group level, basically a single, so this is for data with multiple time points, multiple people and multiple time points. So like I said, I had 55 athletes tracking everything for 80 days, and it ended up using a subset because you need it to be a square shaped. So imagine though we had 50 athletes and 50 days of tracking. So we have a nice square. And first we do the group level. So we take a single time point and we analyze the thing we're interested in for all the subjects on day 1, then all the subjects on day 2, and all the subjects on day 3. And so whatever the thing we want to analyze, we have that for each day separately. Then we would put all that together, get some means, standard deviation, all that. Then we do it at the individual level. And then you would take all days, so subject 1 for all days, subject 2 for all days, subject 3 for all days. So then we summarize that. So we've basically sliced our data horizontally and vertically. And if those summary stats are the same, statistically speaking, then the data are ergodic. And if those are different, the standard deviations or the means, then the data are non-ergodic. And in that case, this non-ergodicity, and again, we can say we can't kind of generalize group findings to individuals.
Right.
And so that was what this study looked at. I was curious on one of the things people recorded each day was their perceived recovery status. So that was a 0 to 100 score of, using a scale of like how recovered they felt. And I was curious if carbohydrate intake, daily carbohydrate intake, would influence that. As a sports nutritionist, we kind of would assume it would, and we want people to have appropriate carbohydrate intake and so on. But this data offered not the only way to look at it, but it was, I think, a pretty unique way. And so what we could do is essentially use kind of like a linear model, but this way allowed me to account for the training load, sleep, and muscle soreness. So, because of course you could say, well, someone's going to higher carbohydrate, someone's going to feel crummier the next day because they probably have had higher carbohydrate on higher training load days, right? Like if someone does a 6-hour bike ride, yeah, their carbohydrate should be higher, but it's very likely that they're going to feel like garbage the next day or whatever, So
because of the training, not the carbs.
Yeah, exactly. So when you use linear model, you can count for the training load, you can account for muscle soreness and sleep quality, because those are all things that were very strong predictors of how someone felt in the morning, just how they slept, and how sore they were. So when you've accounted for those things, you can kind of theoretically isolate an effective carbohydrate. And it turned out for some people it really helped them. More carbohydrate, and they generally felt better when accounting for all that, after accounting for all that stuff. For some people had a negative impact. So it means there's other things that needed to still be accounted for, or carbohydrate itself wasn't helpful to make them feel better. And some people had no influence. So this paper was kind of exploring just that approach to do that, and what it found. And then to try to figure out who was going to respond one way or the other, we used like a decision tree, a machine learning model to kind of estimate that. But I think the more important takeaway from the paper, I guess it's more from a research perspective, like we need to consider these group and individual differences with this type of data. And here's kind of an approach, to do that. Because previously, there's only one other study in sports science, and they just looked at a bivariate correlation. So I think there's it was a cool kind of build on what had previously been done. And it kind of is like, it's just bringing this topic hopefully to more people's attention, because again, we can't just assume. We got to kind of check this in our data.
Right.
It should be done.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a cool also like side from this one project that could be applied elsewhere in different research settings. But so from like, I guess like the actual research question that you use this model for was on carbohydrate intake and perceived recovery.
Yeah.
And you're saying that some people found it beneficial, some people didn't.
Yeah, some people didn't. Yeah.
And what else did you find? Did you find that like carbohydrate intake was related to HRV, or because you measured all these?
Really wasn't. Yeah.
Things.
So HRV, that was a tricky one. This is another paper that's kind of looking at how well can we predict the perceived recovery status and HRV changes like tomorrow, essentially based on like everything we have up until we have your data from today. Can we predict what your recovery score is going to be tomorrow? And you can do that fairly well. That paper has been under review for a while. We're still waiting on that one. But
that's cool.
There is a preprint on that one. But basically the effect on HRV was like non-existent.
Oh, okay.
And so of carbohydrate, there was and we can predict HRV fairly well. The change in HRV from today to tomorrow can predict fairly well based on if we look at like what the HRV has been doing the past week, like some rolling averages and some kind of things. So basically, it's kind of what it's been doing is the most important thing of what it's going to be doing tomorrow.
Right.
As
Was
far as
HRV? Oh, sorry.
No, let's go ahead.
Was HRV related to their perceived recovery?
Oh, that's a good question.
Like if I feel good and then
yeah, it's
my
HRV
HRV
good.
is
Yeah.
high, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel good because and my HRV is high. That makes sense.
That is a good question, and it's been about a year since I've kind of looked at that one because it's been off the place. So that is a good question. The HRV, the biggest thing HRV was related to by far and away, which is not surprising, is resting heart rate. So it's almost like if someone's measuring your resting heart rate, I don't even see a need for HRV. If someone didn't want to use HRV, I'm sure someone would be getting mad at me right now. But like it's so negatively related that like it's
Right.
they stand in for each other in a lot of people, not for everyone, but for a lot of people.
Yeah. No, that's.
But one of the biggest, I don't know if disappointing is the right word, but like I looked at how well can we predict HRVs, the change in HRV for tomorrow, using kind of all the data, so like all the training of the past week and the diet and all that stuff, and like I said, when you kind of consider everything, it can get it pretty darn good, especially in some people. But when you just take the things that we might call modifiable things, so like how much you eat and your training. So if you ignore kind of the previous HRV measurements and kind of like, again, just looking at the modifiable things, you cannot predict anything. Like, it's like, yeah.
So you need
really
that
like,
previous HRV data to be able to
to have any kind of good prediction. Yeah, you need that.
That's so interesting
Yeah.
because you think like, oh, I'm going to do all these things to improve my HRV or change my HRV. And you're saying that those modifiable factors was not related to next day HRV.
Yeah, very, very, yeah, not very much.
That's super interesting. Okay, this has been a ton of science talk. To wrap this up, I'd love to talk about just like the practical things that you've learned throughout your research. And because you work with athletes, like how has your practice changed? How do you use fasted exercise? I know you're a fan of like the protein instead of fasted exercise to just mimic the fasted state. So like what, if you were working with an endurance athlete, like is periodization and carbohydrate intake, is that like a big focus of their nutrition protocol?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think if we're thinking about like a triathlete, maybe training, let's say 10 to 12 hours, 10 to 14 hours a week, somewhere in there. Yeah, I typically, I wouldn't usually recommend fasted training for someone like that. Definitely adjusting, like looking at something like their TSS, if they're using Training Peaks or something like that, of adjusting their daily carb intake based on their training load and using something like TSS to kind of say, okay, this day you need, you could get very prescriptive down to a formula based on these numbers, but at the very least kind of looking at, okay, more carbs on bigger training days, less carbs on lower training days. So from a daily perspective, I'll take, and then with some of my athletes, I will definitely give a meal by meal, kind of like here's how you should, here's where you need the big meals, here you need the small meals and moderate meals, and based on the training, those are for people training multiple times a day, you kind of get very micromanagey with it if you want to, but generally I think that probably the most important tangible thing people could do is kind of line up their intake with their training load a bit better.
And so you don't do any like carb manipulations to manipulate fuel substrate utilization during exercise in the hopes that it's promoting some sort of adaptation?
Well, yes and no. I think it's like if I think about people, like I have some elites that are training, let's say kayakers training 12 to 15 hours a week. They're gonna, by doing that, kind of manage, you want them to end in that sweet spot. So yeah, I wouldn't like drastically reduce someone, but you wouldn't load them up before an easy session, or like something like that. So you kind of, to me, it's where you end is more important than where you start with your glycogen levels.
Right.
And so as long as, if someone's got a 1 hour easy session in any sport, I suppose, any discipline, you want them to end up, let's say, with a third of the tank of gas, roughly there. So you might start them with a half tank of gas, metaphorically speaking, so that they can end there. You don't need to start with a depleted tank, even if it's a 1 hour easy session, because they're going to end up in that low zone anyway.
And so how would you do that? Like, are you talking like sleep low type things where if you're
As I
manipulating?
say, no, I generally no, but you might say, oh, only, it's in the example of, let's say someone has a morning hard session and then an afternoon easy session, then the breakfast might be a good whack of carbs, 80 to 100 grams of carbs after the morning session, and then like 50 at lunch, and then they can do their afternoon session, which is by no means refill the tank. I mean, if we think about, when you think about carb loading studies that deplete someone and then need to replete them, I mean, it might be like 10 grams per kilogram, right? Like to go from like 0 to 100% tank, probably even more. But let's just say, easy math, 10 grams per kilogram to fill up a tank of gas. So if someone's at 30% roughly after a training session, that they might need another 7 grams per kilogram to get to 100%, right? Like roughly speaking. And I know it's not linear, but like, so by having like 102 grams per kilogram in between those sessions, like they're gonna be nowhere close to full. They'll still have enough to get through that session, and then they can kind of adjust accordingly. So I guess I kind of try to imagine the moving fuel gauge and keep it so that they end up always around a quarter tank.
And do you use any of your own calculators and apps in your clients?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, looking at how someone, like if someone tracks their diet, not everyone obviously likes to, most people don't, but if some people that like, they don't mind or enjoy tracking their diet, and I might ask for like the last 2 weeks, I just do something like, say, give me 2 weeks of the macros, and then also your training peaks data from the 2 weeks, and we can kind of just look at TSS each day versus the total TSS each day versus total carbs each day. And that should be a nice kind of positive correlation. And sometimes you might see it spread all over the place. And a really, I think, positive step would be to kind of squeeze someone into that regression line a little bit closer, so that on these low training days, they're not going super high, and on the high training days, they're not going super low. So the closer they're getting to this kind of best fit line, and then you can change the slope of the line if you want. And I will kind of, for people that like tracking, I'll kind of gradually, we might change the slope in the intercept. I mean, it's basically this, it's a basic, if we remember math, regression equation where you can change the slope and you can change the intercept, and then that can adjust how someone should, or that can track with however someone should adjust their carbs based on their training load.
Yeah. Super cool. That's awesome. That's awesome that you have the tools to be able to do this. Okay, I have one more question, and it's also a surprise question because you brought up critical power, and
they've all been surprise questions, to be fair.
And I have another just question in general. Zone 2 training below critical power, and you're saying that above critical power is required for these signals to promote these adaptations.
Well, for AMPK adaptations.
Right. Okay. But do you think that, like, what other adaptations would, just like calcium signaling below?
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So you're saying what are the adaptations that would come from zone 2
Yeah,
training?
like if you were above or below critical power, like what would above promote better adaptation or more?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, above, I mean, it's gonna be the AMPK signaling. The calcium signaling will be probably pretty much either. I mean, that's just going to be the repeated contraction. So the low intensity training, a long low intensity, so 2 hours easy, you get a lot of that, obviously more contractions, and so the calcium signaling will be doing its job there. And then ideally you're still going to end up with lowish glycogen, even though you won't be burning through glycogen very fast in a low session, a zone 2 session. You're going to still be burning through it. So you're going to end hopefully in that kind of sweet spot where there's going to be some good signaling, and you'll get the free fatty acid signaling from that low training.
All right. Okay.
And so that's where that can really, I think, shine. The middle training, I think that's an interesting one. And it's, obviously people can get way too precious about zone 2, but I think there is some rationale to think like the acidosis will, when your pH drops, that's going to impair some of these mitochondrial adaptations. That's why bicarb can be beneficial. But if someone's doing a long kind of a session that's not quite above critical power and not getting those adaptations or signaling but they're kind of too high for they're still getting some acidosis and pH drop, you might be kind of impairing some of the potential of the low intensity signals, the low intensity adaptations that will be becoming, because kind of in that middle zone where maybe it's a bit too acidic to get the and it could blunt some of the mitochondrial signaling. That's just theoretical or hypothetical, but there's reason to think,
Yeah, I've heard people talk about this like no man's land of training, and I'm just like, I never really understood it, because I'm like, isn't it all just like you're just moving the dial?
It's continuum, but I mean, I think you can argue, well, one, you don't recover as well, so your HRV won't recover as well when you're above like VT1. So when you're in that middle zone, it takes longer to recover from a session. So there's one. So you couldn't in theory accumulate as much volume because you're not going to recover as well. And then of course you're not going to go as hard in the hard sessions. So that's probably the main reason people that's probably, want to stay a little bit out of that, unless you're not training them. Like if you're training 6 hours a week, or, it's really just exercising, then it doesn't matter anyway. But if for someone that's training, 12 plus hours a week, that becomes much more relevant. But I think, like I said, the free fatty acid signaling, maybe some of the pH signaling, I think that could probably have an effect there.
Okay, that's great to know. Thank you. One last question. I lied.
Yeah.
What about withholding carbohydrates post exercise and like in that low glycogen state? Do you think that?
Yeah. That's another one, I think, and I was going to mention it before and I forgot when we talked about the free fatty acid signaling, but the twice daily training without carbohydrate, with in between, like those early low glycogen studies, the ones that show the biggest benefit would do 2 sessions with like 2 hours apart with only water in between. Even that initial study with that one-legged knee extensor, and then I think Hansen, basically the ones that show the biggest benefit, train people, and then the twice daily training group would just have water and then train again. So that is not fun, and it goes kind of against the most recommendations. But that, I think, so what I think is really the underappreciated thing that I think is happening there is that we know free fatty acids increase after exercise. So they've increased, you've not fed, and carbs would could lower them. So you've done a session, you increase free fatty acids, then you start that next session with the free fatty acids already elevated. I think that's a real powerful thing that's happening. And so probably there's some benefit to be had from that. Now it's probably a bigger stress on your body, and it's probably not advisable for people training a ton, but I think there's something there. And then also it was I know what was the first author, Andrade, I think, some from South America, but David Bishop was involved, where they did low glycogen training, but kind of sleep low, like 15 hours apart, or like I think it was like 2 hours apart. So basically 2 sessions in close proximity or farther apart, with also, but still the same low glycogen for that second session. And there was some differences. The 2 sessions in close proximity had kind of more profound, powerful effects on the signaling than separating it. So there's something beyond just the glycogen levels that is doing something.
Okay.
And so it's exercising twice at close proximity. Maybe it's not just the free fatty acids that are elevated. Maybe it's some of the other signaling, but you've basically sent all this stuff up, and then you kind of hit it again a couple hours later when everything is already elevated. Then that's. But I think it could be the free fatty acids have a unique role there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, and I lied. This is my last lie. I have one more question.
Okay.
If you did, so after high intensity exercise in the fasted state, like just basic exercise physiology of what we know, like you do a high intensity bout of high intensity exercise, and then after exercise, you get this release of free fatty acids, even though glycerol was already increased. So we know that lipolysis is going on. It's just that maybe the blood flow, whatever, is trapping the free fatty acids until blood flow resumes, and then we get it into our bloodstream. But if we had carbs before a high intensity training session, do you think that we would get that like influx of free fatty acids post exercise, or do you think that insulin would be preventing lipolysis?
No, I think you'd still. I don't know if this has been looked at. Maybe someone has, but like the post free fatty acids, that'll still be high if you've beaten carbs beforehand.
Okay.
Possibly even, I want to say possibly even higher, but I can't recall. But it definitely would be a non-issue.
Oh, okay. So like whatever, like epinephrine signaling and all the beta adrenergic stuff that's going
Yeah,
on.
that paper of the Andreas Fritzen one I mentioned, that does look into some of that, and that's when I really opened my eyes to just how powerful the free fatty acid signaling could be, and especially in the post exercise window. So that
Okay, this is
yeah.
cool. Like if you withheld, I guess, food intake for a couple
Yeah,
hours after, you would maybe enhance signaling through free fatty acids.
yeah, I think, or yeah, just have the protein, and this is where that kind of the sleep low, but maybe it doesn't have to be an overnight, and it could be just like 2 hours, or you do you can eat breakfast, do an interval session, maybe swim or whatever, and then eat a protein, have some protein. A couple hours later, do one more workout, and then like that's probably a really powerful kind of 1-2 punch.
Yeah, cool. All right. I love it. Let's end here. This was such a pleasure. Thank you again for taking the time to chat. And where can people find you?
Oh, I suppose Twitter is probably a good way to stay in touch. My what is my name? Eat Sleep Fit Jeff.
What is
Not
my
super.
name?
I'm sorry, my thing. You can find me there. That's probably the best place just to kind of stay in touch.
All right. I will link all that below. All right. Thank you again.
Awesome.
Have a lovely day. And I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.